Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to find the warmth of our sun. I'm Matthew Browngan here, your host at Masson365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Kind of continuing on the police reform front, really going to be focusing this week a bit on the narrative of that we're really presented by with the media and something that's called manufacturing consent or manufactured consent. It's something that when I apologize, because I've actually never actually heard the name, just heard the names pronounced, just read material. But Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky created or wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent. It's a concept of how the media defends the economic, social, and political agendas of the ruling class. Great book. Read it. It will help you better analyze the media. You don't have to agree with all of it, but it's a really good book, particularly in the role the media plays in upholding the status quo of our current social order. So this role, that they play in talking about crimes and social issues and police reform specifically, is this came up, and it's something that I've talked about here and there, but haven't focused on, and decided to focus on it this week specifically because a tweet that came across highlighting this aspect of it is Andrew Cuomo on CNN presenting a graph as he was talking about the rising crime. Crime isn't rising. Violent crime is rising, but it's being driven by shootings. But violent crime has been dropping since this summer. So it's this whole thing, but it's how he presented it that really launches off. And the tweet did a great job in highlighting what's wrong with how he presented and framed what we was talking about. His whole thing was based upon his own bias of believing that we needed to have harsher laws and law and order type of rhetoric, things that we would have seen straight out of the 80s and 90s, as well as President Trump in real ways. So he presented a graph as he was talking about this rise in violent crime. But this graph wasn't all it seemed. He mentioned it in passing of what it actually was, which was a graph of the perception of the public. It was a Pew research study, or presented data from the Pew research study about how adults perceive violent crime, or how much they perceive it to be a serious problem. Not only did he frame it oddly, like he was presenting a graph on violent crime, not the public perception of violent crime, but he also inverted the x-axis, where it made October 2018 being the last data point. So this would have been like, if you're reading left to right, it would have been on the right-hand side. And where this ended, the April data point on the left-hand side. So as you're reading it, you think the April 2021 data point was the original starting data point, and that the August one is the most recent one. So they inverted that, and it just so happened that the August one, adults perceive violent crime as a serious problem at a higher percentage than the most recent one in April. If you looked at it and watched it passively, you would think there's a rise in violent crime, not the perception. Most recently, so you just processed this thing wrong. So what he was doing was manipulating data and information to present it in a specific way to support his worldview, to uphold the status quo of harder laws and law and order and crime and punishment and all of that. So before I really dig into the meat of that, let's hit this side dish. What does the data tell us about violent crime? First, go back to a few episodes past and you'll be able to see one where I specifically did one on violent crime, and really went through the data. So let's kind of think this out, and where I kind of talk through this and some of these things. First, it isn't a rise in crime; it's a rise in violent crime, specifically gun-related crimes. All right, and it seems to have a mixture of causes such that most social ills do. The rise in violent crime is happening across cities, across the political spectrum. So these aren't cities, these aren't just progressive cities, these aren't just conservative cities or liberal cities, it's across the spectrum. And actually, two of recent progressive prosecutors, forgetting the exact cities, but it's in the last podcast, the other podcast, actually saw a drop in shootings and violent crime. So this isn't anything to do specifically with the types of politics or police reform initiatives that are being embraced, or the laws and policy practices that are being embraced. This is across the board. Also, the rise started happening before the George Floyd protests. Not after, but before. On top of that, we have to recognize the reality that defund, it hasn't been a mass adopted policy at all, or really even adopted at all. In fact, many of the cities that claiming they have done defund actually haven't. It's mostly been accounting tricks on whether it's been anticipated budgets, right, being cut or shifting of money. It's most of it. It's just been accounting tricks. And those that have, it's been pennies on the dollar. You're talking about like single digit percentages and low single digit percentages. So it's not like these departments are massively defunded or suffering a lack of resources or anything like that. Some cities have invested indeed in mental health first response units. I might add, to great effect. Denver, with their recent pilot program, showed that mental health professionals that responded, as they evaluated the pilot program within it, never had to call the police to the scene for help. Not a single time, as within the evaluation, it was like over 300 some days or something like that. Over 300 some calls. They never had to. But largely this hasn't happened. And we should note that any of the cities that claim to have defunded, this wouldn't have been until the 2021 budget season. So this, like in Madison, this would have been the fall of 2020. Some cities actually didn't even do budgetary stuff until the spring. So the budgets would have only been taking effect in, at earliest, 2021. But the rise in crime was already, the rise in shootings was already happening. And again, and in fact, in many cities, you're already starting to see it decline. So defund hasn't happened. What's going on? Well, I should actually, a quick ad. According to a Peace Research Institute, the U.S. policing budgets would rank as the world's third highest military expenditure. The U.S. and China military expenditures rank 1 and 2. U.S. police expenditures would rank third among the globe in military expenditures. It's a standing army. And according to The Triumph of Injustice by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckerman, we spend twice as much on police as we do social welfare. So defund hasn't happened. That isn't the cause of the rise in shootings. So what do we see? And what does the data tell us? It says that, we saw a lot of people lose their jobs, especially low-wage workers, over the past couple of years, even before the pandemic. We also know through previous past studies that there is a causation between unemployment rates and violent crimes. This is on top of a very stressed social fabric, particularly even more stressed with COVID. And then we had the mass proliferation of guns. So we have all these guns all over the place, stressed social fabric, high unemployment amongst a certain subsect of our populations, and boom, there we go. That's what's going on. Harsher laws aren't going to do anything, particularly for not taking guns off the streets. And again, a lot of the guns that end up on the streets are purchased legally. Originally, at least. So, there is this spike. Some places, again, like Chicago and New York City, have seen a dip. The rise is on the heels of 30-plus year continuous fall of crime, especially violent crime. And it doesn't take much when continuously falling for a small rise in hard numbers to present as a massive rise in percentages. And this holds true here. The hard numbers haven't been exponentially higher, but because we've seen this fall, a 200% rise is a small rise in hard numbers. Now, again, that's not to minimize what's going on, just really to put it into context. But all this context is important when we're talking about the media, so let's bring it back around to that. So what does manufactured consent have to do with this all? With the Kumo graph and framing is used to push this law and order rhetoric. It's used to establish or really reinforce the status quo. And what is the status quo, particularly as how the police present themselves? And that is a thin blue line between law and, chaos. You would have, if you listen to police rhetoric over the last 30 years, you would think that we have this perceptually like this ongoing rise in violent crime on the cusp of chaos and might as well be a Attila the Hun running through our cities and countryside. But their rhetoric doesn't match the fall. And the media has adapted and continued, and they've never I'd say adopted, but they've never broken away from it. That's how they talk about it. That's the framing. Even if you watched MSNBC or CNN and particularly Fox News and even look to local media, how they present crime, particularly violent crime, is that we're on the verge of this large breakout in chaos. You wouldn't think, and in fact, data backs this up, that the majority of people believe crime has been rising or is higher than it actually is because of this manufactured consent through the media. If we think about it, particularly at the local level, most crime and most police reporting happens at the local level. This is where most folks get their news, and it's presented with a very specific view and framing of that of the police. The police record is given the benefit of the doubt. It is the so-called official record of the event. Police are also the ones reporting crime, and again, these stats are taken at face value, just like the police accounts of an event. This is the official record, and there's no real independent verification going on of crime data. So what's wrong with that? Well, one, we don't have independent verification of crime data. Two, police lie. They lie all the time. A great recent example of this, unfortunately, is George Floyd. A police report originally read, "Man dies after medical incident during police interaction." It also read of a forgery in progress and that he appeared to be under the influence. So we have multiple things going on here. First, the police didn't exactly lie, but they didn't exactly tell the truth either. You could comb through documented police shootings over the past years and see the reports not line up with the events and at times outright lie. Tamir Rice is also an example of this, where they say they gave him warnings and he didn't follow the warnings, and so they had to shoot this 12-year-old kid. When the video often evidence is this police car rolling up, them getting out of the car and shooting. Like, there's no time for even the boy to react. They may have warned him to drop your guns. They may have yelled it, but then they started drop your gun, which was a toy gun again, in Ohio, which is an open carry state. But they gave him no time to react. So they may have said that, but then they started shooting right away. But there's even more evidence, there's evidence that again, there was, what's this again? It's hard, you get lost in these names. But one of the shootings in Chicago, police outright lied. There's multiple evidence of police outright lying. They lie all the time, on the record, off the record, in reports, cover up evidence. Police have lost the benefit of the doubt, at least to me, and they should to you too. They need to gain that back. Just because they are an authority doesn't mean that they aren't acting one on their own behalf, and two, doesn't mean that they don't lie. Why are police given this benefit of the doubt when they show they lie all the time? But the media doesn't question that. They take their report as the official accounting of an event. They don't question the report given to them by police. They don't even think if they're lying. They don't look to try and verify it. And then when they might present another side, the media then writes all sorts of doubt about that other side. A lot of times it's also driven by the police reports, such as suggesting they were on drugs or looking into their history and saying, well, this person committed a crime and in the past, and they vilify the person. It's also what happened to Tony Robinson. Locally, Tony Robinson, he was on drugs, yes. But let's think of this of kind of walk this through. He was on drugs. One, that's not and shouldn't be a death sentence. His friends called 911 for help. They called and said he needs help. He's having a mental health disturbance. He was in a mental health crisis. Matt Kenney showed up, didn't follow procedures in various aspects of things, and killed him. But the way that the media presented this, they presented him as violent. They talked about him running out in the streets, hitting cars. But again, the framing of it presented to the public was one to justify the use of force, saying he was high, out of control, dangerous, and violent criminal. That's what was presented by the police and much of the media. Now, what's an alternate framing? One that might humanize him, Tony Robinson, that is, would say that a man was experiencing, 18-year-old, a mental health crisis, with police called to help, but an officer failed to keep calm in the situation and then shot and killed him. Now, some would say, well, that's not the objective reading. Well, what is the objective reading? The police account? How's that one objective? How's this less objective than a drummed up and changing police report, because Matt Kenney's report changed multiple times over? Again, when we know police lie, and this is what I described as also what happened. That's exactly what happened. Kenney didn't keep control or composure of himself. He lost composure, decided deadly force was appropriate, and killed him. Well, legally, he might have been able to do it. Moral justification is quite low in this. So again, there's this giving of the benefit of the doubt that then presents and justifies the status quo. The media isn't questioning the use of force spectrum and why police are able to get away with killing people with impunity the way that they should be. They don't question or critically think through police reports and the so-called official story. They present and adopt their framing. They present and report in crime in very sensational ways that protect the status quo, that don't interrogate and investigate the racist history of police and criminal justice system. And in fact, when they do that, they believe that it is not being objective. When, there is no objective stance in this. It's all really subjective in a lot of real ways. So the police framing on crime and their own role in society, police present crime as a way, as always, on the verge of being out of control, even if it has been falling for 30 years. They also present themselves as the only way to handle crime. I might add, simultaneously telling us that they don't address the underlying root causes of crime, of these social ills they are asked to respond to, and are asked to respond to do too much. But then when presented with police reform, like, oh. So what is it? Is it two Walios or one Mike? So then within all of this is the full justification of state violence to keep the criminal element at bay. And the framing of the criminal element must be pushed, that must be punished, right? That's the framing, like they must be punished away. To hand wave away any structural investments by saying, yes, invest in housing, jobs, etc., but, while at the same time not using the same energy to actually push our own government to invest in structural issues. So the media plays this commentary on crime. All right, a lot of journalists would do this, and Kuma was doing this, playing this commentary. Yes, we should do all these other things, but so they'll play that and present it as the objective reality. But then when it comes to investing in social infrastructure, then it's time to play both sides of the ball. Like, well, are we spending too much money on this? Apparently, they never question for spending too much money on police. Again, basically a standing army. Third highest military budget would be the third biggest military budget in the world. But they're not questioning that. And in fact, when calls to defund, they're like, oh, hold up. But when it comes to investing in things that actually get to the root cause of these social ills, now we're spending too much money. Now let's hear this other side. Well, what about this, that? Then it's all of a sudden this play both sides. This calling balls and strikes. But when again, it's about presenting and uplifting the status quo, it's objective. You don't need to really hear that much of the other side. They don't present the other side in the same way. And this gets around to other things, such as presenting the narrative of what people want and what the woke don't talk about, which again, in the same kind of clip, Kuma was also saying that the very same show, woke activists don't want to talk about this. But this is also massively misleading, and be getting into this data and these ideas and really breaking apart these things as this continues. But in one hand, people don't want to, there's these surveys that people don't want to defund the police, but there's also surveys that show there's a massive amount of support for policies that shift money from police budgets into things that address these social ills. Which last I remember is, the positive platform of defunding the police. This also makes me think of abolition, where we might present abolitionists as a much ideologically closer aligned thing than they actually were. There's a broad spectrum of abolitionists. Some were colonists, wanting to send all the freedmen to colonize parts of Africa. There's a country that actually happened with that, right? Others didn't believe in integration. Lincoln was a colonist and then this not believing in integrating to full society. There's a broad spectrum, just like there's a broad spectrum of those within defund. Some are abolitionists, some are more reformist, and a lot of things in between. But what we know is that the polls aren't this clear cut. But again, what does the media present? And then again, additionally, the woke don't want to talk about this. Kumo was getting to that again. Additionally, many of these same activists, organizations have organized anti-violent marches, created anti-violent organizations, work within communities, and advocating for policies that do a lot to reduce violence. Cities United is a great example of this, which uses violent interruption and types of ideas and approaches crime as a public health manner. Cities United does a much better job within their model of reducing violent crime than police do, but again, invested in pennies on the dollar. But then the press are like, where's the woke on this? But they're ignoring these things. They're not reporting on these things. They don't report on Stop the Violent marches, at least in the same way, in the same manner as a shooting. And they act like community members and woke people aren't getting behind these things, aren't presenting actual ideas to get at these social ills, but they are. But again, the media doesn't really write or talk about these things as they sensationalize violence, again, upholding the status quo of manufacturing consent for a violent state. So there's a lot going up to here. And all this adds up to a narrative that we must continue this massive investment in police, that things are almost out of control, that we must use violence to stop this violence. And there's always the implication of race in this, that Black and brown people aren't taking responsibility for their own communities, for themselves. And, well, that's the big problem, is family dynamics. And again, all these things that aren't actually backed up by data, but perceptions and cultural stories. So this isn't really about values. It's not about individual responsibility, but a failing government and a media that gives cover to the failings by supporting an argument for a standing army of cops to violently suppress Black and brown people. It's a narrative that has been around since emancipation. You'll find the exact same rhetoric about cities and newly freed people, about black violence and the inherence of black criminality. It has been a myth that has infected our society since emancipation, and even before that. So it's very, this idea of values and black people don't value this and need to address. Again, you can go back and find this exact same rhetoric in Reconstruction America about the violent Negro element and the lack of values. This is a racist argument. And again, the idea of lack of values, one is it's cultural racism, along with other aspects of it, but is a lie. Again, the data doesn't back this up. Present me the data that it's not values, or that it is values. So this keeps us stuck where we keep having the wrong conversations, as it's about, yes, police get too violent sometimes, but we still need them to be violent other times. It creates a situation where only a narrow set of police reforms are even talked about as possible, where nothing is wrong with the institution or the criminal justice system and the social neglect of entire populations. Instead, it puts the blame of social failings on civilians that suffer from a broken social contract. We accept the breaking of the obligation of our government and consent to the continuation of the breaking of this obligation and the use of force to maintain the order of this broken obligation. Our government is obliged to serve us and to support us as a society. Crime stats aren't data of individual social failings or failure values of individuals or communities, but is a failure of government. It is a failure to uphold their obligation to support those that live within the state. And the media is part of this. If they told a different story, a different framing, a different narrative, think back to CRT and the use of narratives and why they're important, we'd have a different society. Social stories and narratives influence the perception of our society and what needs to be done. And at times, things holding back progress happen within small margins. That a change in the larger social narrative can create a world of difference. Think within Madison and how close, by 1-2 votes, the permanent men's homeless shelter didn't pass. Again, maybe if there's a larger change in narrative, would have shifted those 1-2 votes, because there would have been different types of public perception and different types of pressure on the elected representatives. But instead, our media is manufacturing consent. That is it for this week at Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. I'll be continuing digging into all this fun crime and law and order and all this fun stuff over the coming weeks. And there is so much to cover, and definitely want to continue doing that and presenting this stuff in as fully as possible. Hope y'all are doing well, staying safe, and y'all should mask up a bit again. That's it. Have a good week. Thanks for coming.
This is 365 Media.